Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast, your ticket to all things college football. Are you looking to get your college football fix? Looking to get the latest news on your favorite school's team? Join us as we talk college football from the national championship to college rivalries to bowl games to the Heisman Trophy to which conference is the best. We've got you covered for the Big Ten, SEC, Big 12, Pac-12, ACC, and everything in between.
Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcasting Network. I'm your host, Ryan Lee, and college football was back a few weeks ago, but with some of the newest updates ever since that first college football Saturday back on September the 5th, the NCAA landscape really is back, but for real this time. I hope you've been staying safe out there and have been enjoying the NCAA football ride like I have. Since today, we're going to be covering the return of football. Not only what's different, but how some of the top programs in the country have fared so far, how the NCAA landscape is different in a pandemic-related world, and I take a deep dive into whether or not college performance actually matters in the pros, how the top prospects have done in the NFL so far, my projections into how they will do this season and throughout their careers. But before we get into any of that, the NCAA really is back. But what will it entail in a COVID-19 world? We'll find out in just a bit. Let's get right into it. But before we do, you're probably wondering who this brand new voice is on the other side. Well, my name is Ryan Lee. I am so delighted and so happy to be the new host of the College Football Podcast here on the GSMC Podcasting Network. And simply put, I am a proud and happy native of the 716 Buffalo, New York. And I'm actually currently in Miami right now, where it's a bit of a change for me, moving to a new city, other side of the country right now, but I've enjoyed it so far. And at least in terms of my allegiances, in terms of sports, I'm a big Sabres and Bills fan because, Buffalo, of course. The crazy thing is, you might not believe me when I say this, but I have no real ties to any NCAA football. I graduated from a small state university outside of Rochester, New York called SUNY Geneseo. Shout out to the Knights. And we're actually so small that we don't even have a college football program. We focus mostly on college hockey, where I spent a good 2 years covering the college hockey landscape down there in Geneseo, along with their sports talk show, Sports 360, as well as being the sports director of WGSU down there in Geneseo. And now I am here, and I am so happy and so pleased to be the next host of this great podcast. Let's just get right into it, because college football is indeed back. But of course, nothing is ever going to stay the same ever since the start of the pandemic. Everything has become a phrase that I have heard way too often, the new normal. It's one of those things that has kind of become inevitable, one of those things that has kind of shifted the way that we think and live, and just generally speaking, we operate all across the board, whether if it's in sports or whether if it's in personal life or work or school, so on and so forth. This pandemic has really brought a lot of things to a crazy whirlwind of emotions and uncertainty, and that definitely was the case for college football. But I'm going to be getting a little more into that in the next segment, because COVID-19 has not only changed the way that we have college football, because there was speculation for the past 6 months or so whether or not we'd even be having it, but what changes would come about from it. I remember back when this thing started, it was supposed to end back in May. We're in September now. I'm recording this on September the 25th. Literally, it was supposedly going to all end back in April or May, but here we are still yet again. And the NCAA really cracked down on some of the changes that they had to make just for the season, including the fact that this doesn't just apply to the schools themselves, having to go to online classes, having to, wear their masks everywhere they go, having to socially distance, their desks all over the classroom. It even, of course, took place inside of the NCAA football locker rooms. Even just some simple stuff like having the masks and the referees simply just mask up, wear those tube scarves or the cloth masks, whatever they choose to wear on the sidelines or on the field itself. They're wearing something. They're trying to have the protective layering so that, trying to set that good example. I know the NBA does a similar thing with their bench where they have their individual chairs about 6 feet apart. It's not necessarily necessary because they're spending so much time together. However, it's just to set that good example. Be like, hey, we are socially distancing. You are too, which is why not only is the NCAA mandating that coaches wear their masks, which is also in the NFL, but also that the sideline benches have been extended. Normally they're from the 25 to the 25, only a grand total of 50 yards. But now it has gone from the 10 to the 10, trying to add those 30 yards to promote better social distancing. Once again, another change that has not only been in the NCAA level, but in the NFL level as well. And it's once again going to set that good example moving forward. Another cool change that I thought really didn't make sense at first, but once I saw it in practice, it really didn't notice. I really didn't notice anything because it just seemed so trivial, I guess is the best way to word it, or it didn't really seem to impact anything that much, which is that referees, they have a tough job. I will not disrespect any referees. I had a friend who did refereeing, not for the NHL or anything crazy like that. They just did some refereeing for some high school varsity games, just went through that training program, and they do a lot of work. They study up very hard. They have to go through all these crazy changes year by year, even week by week. But the thing that the referees have probably had to adjust to the most are two things that were mandated by the NCAA as of this year. Number one was the introduction of this virtual or electric whistle, as it was called. The guy who actually made the original patent for the whistle, the plastic one that you stick in your mouth, the one that you're most familiar with, the guy who patented that, who created that original design, number one, he's still alive. And number two, he's the one who came up with this idea for the virtual whistle. Now, what is this virtual whistle exactly? Well, it's a button that the referees are holding in their hand, essentially, and all they're doing is they're clicking it whenever they feel like, they're ready to whistle the play dead, whether if it's a penalty, whether they stepped out of bounds, whether it's to mark the start and end of plays, so on and so forth. And to me, this makes perfect sense in the COVID world now, considering the fact that, referees are being asked to mask up and then they're going to pull their mask down for the whistle. Like, that really doesn't make sense to me. It makes sense to nobody. So what they did was they implemented these electric whistles, handheld buttons, where when they push it, the whistle sound emits from the speakers, and that way it has essentially the exact same effect. I personally think it makes perfect sense just to kind of find a way to reduce those air particles and that spit going into the air and going into the faces of coaches and players or whoever else is in the relative vicinity. I think it makes perfect sense. I think, we're kind of shifting into this more technological side of things where everything that seems so basic and easy, I guess, for lack of a better term, has been shifting to digital in some way, somehow. But I am not 100% sure if they use this in the NFL or not. I haven't been paying close enough attention to the way that the NFL has done this, but I know this has been something used by the NCAA a lot. And it is going to most likely stick around, especially in the COVID-19 world, assuming that, whatever cure or vaccine doesn't come about soon. Another huge change, at least on the officiating side for the NCAA, that for me at least makes so much sense and should have been done sooner, is the fact that they are trying to make video reviews quicker. Everyone knows that no matter what sport you're in, there's instant replay. You watch it on TV, you watch it in live. there's going to be a video replay somewhere, whether if it's, from the TV or from the Jumbotron or whatever. There's always video replays whenever there's a stoppage. And the thing is that the referee's job is not easy. Using these electric whistles, learning new rules every single year, trying to adjust to the ebbs and flows of the game. It's not easy, not for anyone. But another major change that's been made, at least in the officiating standpoint, has been made by the NCAA coordinator of officiating, Steve Shaw, and this is upon video reviews. Every controversial call, what do you see over and over again? You see the replay over and over and over again, especially in those controversial moments, especially, across almost all sports. You get a coach's challenge. You watch the same replay over and over and over again. Well, Steve Shaw and his officiating crew, they're trying to find a way to make that more efficient. How they might do that, you may ask? They put a cap on not the number of angles, not the number of times you can view something, but the amount of time you can take to look at it. 2 minutes is all you get. If you cannot make a decision in 2 minutes, the call must be upheld, must stand. And the exact quote from Shaw was that, quote, if you get close to 2 minutes and you can't tell, or you're still looking for the right view, then there's your answer. That's from Steve Shaw on the New York Times. I personally think this is a good rule. This is a controversial topic across the board because a lot of my sports analytics friends, a lot of the super analytic nerds, I'm one of them, they're going to say you need to make sure you have the right call. That's why they should take the time and make sure that the replay is perfect. Make sure every angle tells the full story. But what Shaw is trying to do, what the NCAA is trying to do, they're trying to cut down on that downtime. They're trying to find ways so that not only can they make the game flow better, make the game quicker, but they're trying to do it so that they're trying to reduce the amount of scrutiny they get. And the NCAA has caught a lot of flack lately. Just the way they've handled the whole college football situation, they've caught a lot of steam. And this will maybe give them a lot more steam. Of course, it's not going to happen now when you have over a dozen games any given Saturday. However, once we get to the point where, we start playing for conference championships, where we start playing for the national championships, we start playing these bowl games, this is when things are going to get heated quickly. I think it's a good rule for the short term, but long term, this is going to be a rule that could potentially blow up in the NCAA's face. I personally am in support of it as of right now. However, I think when the time comes, whether it's the bowl game or conference championship, they should just let it slide. Maybe make it closer to like 3 minutes or 5. Because to me personally, being a football fan, it doesn't matter what level you're on. You have to make sure the call's right. More than anything. And sometimes the answer is clear and obvious according to the tape. However, sometimes it's not. And sometimes you do need to get all the angles and mash them together. So we'll have to see how this whole officiating thing goes with the 2-minute cap. But I want to move on to the next thing, which is about the games themselves, about capacity and noise. I went to the Buffalo Bills versus the Miami Dolphins in Miami about a week ago. It was about this past Sunday. Phenomenal game, by the way. Not only did my Bills win, but also the fact that I got a good glimpse of what this is going to be like. This whole socially distant, partial capacity crowd, what it looks like, what it feels like, what it sounds like. Not only so I could get it from an NFL perspective, but it helps bring me into the NCAA perspective as well, because in the NCAA, more teams are having fans than not. Which to me at least makes perfect sense. Because a lot of these schools, they are in person. They're doing some hybrid classes. Some of them are online. So on and so forth. Obviously with these partial capacity, they want to socially distance their fans on at least almost every single game that I've seen so far, where they had the fans, socially distanced and with masks, is the right move. Which is what I had to do when I went to that Bills-Dolphins game. I had to wear a mask the whole time and I had to be socially distanced from people. It's a very different situation with the NCAA, but in terms of the four big major pro sports, baseball, hockey, basketball, and the NFL, college football comes close to none of them, because what they're doing is so unprecedented that it is just absolutely insane to me. It is insane to me how they're letting some of this stuff fly. Some of these school presidents, how some of these NCAA crews. I'm going to get into a little bit. But let me break down what most of these leagues and what some of these officials are doing, at least in terms of the pandemic standpoint. The NHL, National Hockey League, they had two bubbles, one in Toronto, one in Edmonton. They tarped off the first couple of seats to make the visuals a little more pleasing, and they had virtual fans. They did also move everyone to Edmonton eventually once they got down to enough teams, which was to the Final Four. That way, they can essentially isolate these players from the outside world and the broadcasters and the medical and coaching staffs. So that way, there's literally zero chance the virus comes in or comes out. NBA, the exact same thing, except there's not two bubbles. There's just the one in Orlando. Everyone was in Orlando. Slowly, teams are getting picked off here and there. And now, with the Final Four in the NBA, that bubble's going to end very soon. But once again, this is another situation where the coronavirus and all that stuff can't come in, can't come out. However, the MLB and the NFL are the two closest examples of what the NCAA has done so far, at least in terms of the COVID standpoint, which is in the MLB, they at least had zero fans. But the thing is that the MLB also played in their own venues, very similar to the NCAA. But the biggest issue with that is even though they had stuffed animals or cutouts or just left the seats empty, the MLB still got so many cases in that initial test run where it faced so much scrutiny and it faced so much adversity just for the sheer fact that they could not contain the virus spreading and they could not contain what was going on because the Miami Marlins had so many cases right out of the gate. The Philadelphia Phillies had cases going out of the gate, so on and so forth across the MLB. I will applaud the NFL right now because I'll give them a lot of credit because they've been able to handle the situation very well despite four teams being allowed to have fans and no other team allowing fans. They cut off the fans from the outside. Kansas City Chiefs, the reigning Super Bowl champions, the Dallas Cowboys, the Miami Dolphins, and the Jacksonville Jaguars, they all allowed fans. And they've done a good job of containing whatever the virus, getting to the players, getting to the coaches. They've done an excellent job at that. I believe they've only had one positive person in the entirety of the fan experience so far through 2 weeks. There was one Kansas City fan, I believe, who tested positive, and that's it. And it hasn't really spread that much far since, even with the contact tracing, which is good. And I believe the latest report from the NFL was that there was no positive cases, which is good. However, the NCAA is not that lucky because they have already had to postpone several games due to players and coaches getting tested positive for COVID-19. The first one came a couple of weeks ago with Tennessee, where they had a scrimmage planned, an inter-squad scrimmage, and that whole thing fell to shambles because of the fact that a bunch of their players, according to the quote by the Tennessee head coach, it was somewhere in the ballpark of 7 to 8 players were actually positive. The rest were contact traced to have been near or in contact with someone who's believed to have the virus. And it shut down their entire practice for the day because anywhere upwards of 30 to 44 of their players could have potentially come in contact with a victim of COVID-19. And this week is literally no different, because throughout the past several weeks, games have been canceled because of the virus, and because players have been testing positive or coaches have been testing positive, so on and so forth. Charlotte versus UNC, North Carolina, that was canceled a little bit ago, but that's because Charlotte had 3 positive players. BYU versus Army got canceled because BYU had, quote, a small number of players test positive, according to the Salt Lake Tribune. And number 7, Notre Dame, the number 7 team in the country, they had 7 players test positive right before the game versus Wake Forest. That's why neither of those teams are supposed to be playing this coming Saturday. I believe the date on that is the 26th. It has been absolutely crazy how this virus situation has been handled, and how scary the situation is, considering the fact that, these guys are what some might consider young and fit and athletic. However, it's serious to your health. So that's why I'm going to end this first segment by saying stay safe, stay distant. If you're working, try to do it from home if possible. If not, keep your mask up. Stay safe out there. And we're going to be back right after this, where we're going to be talking about conferences coming back and how, not only in the landscape of the relative conferences, but how they shake up the entire picture of the NCAA. That's going to be coming up right after this.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines, they got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
And we're back here in the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcasting Network. Ryan Lee back here once again. We just talked about how the NCAA landscape has changed ever since the onset of the coronavirus pandemic. And because of that, a bunch of conferences actually opted out. But as of the most recent updates that I have at the time recording this, which is on Friday, September the 25th at about 11 p.m., there have actually been some major breakthroughs that have come in the past several weeks. Not even past several weeks, past several days. Literally as early as September the 16th, which is about a week and a half ago. Yes, the Big Ten is coming back. They're resuming with an 8-game schedule starting as early as October 24th, in about a month from now. And this is actually significant because the Big Ten, at least by itself, they had some big-time teams that are now back into the equation, at least in terms of the preseason rankings. So these are the rankings made by the NCAA before the season started. You had Ohio State in at number 2, Penn State coming at number 7, Wisconsin was at 12, Michigan was at 16, Minnesota was at 19, and Iowa was at 24. And that does not include the teams who weren't ranked, including the likes of Indiana, including the likes of Michigan State, so on and so forth. And the crazy thing is that this shakes up the Big Ten alone shakes up the entire picture of what the landscape is going to be like for the NCAA moving forward, at least in terms of this year. Because the Pac-12, they also announced that they are coming back. And this announcement came as of Thursday, September the 24th, where the Pac-12 said they're going to have a 7-game schedule, which is going to resume as early as November the 6th. Now, why is that important? Because I tried to say a couple of weeks ago when right before the Big Ten, the Pac-12 chose to come back, that they should coordinate and play for the Rose Bowl, because I wasn't sure the national championship's going to shake up. And there's still not a clear picture on how the NCAA championship is going to pan out. There's no clear indication whether they do it by winning percentage, whether they do it by the overall records, whether they do it by some other crazy system, whether if it's just simply by the ranking, the aggregate rankings of, the college football rank makers. It's going to be tough to see how this pans out, especially with those two big conferences, because going into it, the Pac-12 has several of the top 25 teams as well. Oregon was 9, USC was 17, Utah was at 22, Arizona State was just outside, along with Washington and Cal, who all have great teams all the way around. I said this right before the Big Ten, the Pac-12 chose to come back, that having these two conferences out is massive for the landscape of the NCAA, because that means you're losing 10 of the top 25 programs in the country going into the season. Literally, the top 25 was not top 25 preseason. It was not a top 25. It was a top 15, which is fair, which is a point that shouldn't really be excluded at all. However, the thing is that any of these teams can make a huge push. That's the big thing about it. It's the fact that Ohio State last year was one play away from making the national championship if Justin Fields just properly communicated with his wide receiver. That's all it takes. It's literally as simple as one play, and Ohio State could have been in the national championship last year. And now they're back in the playoffs, or they at least have a chance again. But the issue is, how is that going to pan out? And we will find out in a little bit. Other conferences that have returned, at least according to the recent announcements, is the Mountain West, which is going to have an 8-game schedule starting as early as October 24th, the same time as the Big Ten, with an 8-game schedule. And literally as early as yesterday, September the 25th, the Mid-American Conference, the MAC, they have announced a 6-game conference schedule, which is going to start on November the 4th, just 2 days before the Pac-12 is going to come back. I said before all of this announcements happens that the Big Ten and the Pac-12 should push for the Rose Bowl, all in for the Rose Bowl, because it made sense to me, because I believe the statement from the Pac-12 chairman was that they want to get something done by November, or at least start playing by November or something like that, which to me makes perfect sense, which is exactly what happened actually. They're playing on the 6th of November. But the thing is that these teams, the variety that they have is so obscure, especially for the way the landscape of the entirety of the NCAA is now. Let's take a look at the NFL. And yes, I'm going to be using NFL examples a lot, because the NFL, to me at least, has set the precedent of what the NCAA is going to become. I believe in the NFL, we have yet to see a more offensive-heavy league all the way around until this year. And there's a massive reason to that. It's because they've had zero time to prepare. The NFL had no preseason when they normally do. They didn't have their OTAs, their training, as many training activities. They had less time to prepare for everything. Literally they would start back up probably like immediately after the draft. They didn't start till July, I believe. And the NFL had to just start in raw, which is normal for NCAA. They typically start in raw. They typically don't have anything to start off with. They just go straight into it. But it's a little bit different for teams like Clemson, like Oklahoma, like Bama, LSU maybe, Georgia maybe, etc., etc. It's one thing to know that 10 of the top contenders are out of the way. Imagine having that relief as Clemson. Oh, I only have to deal with Bama. We know how to deal with them. Oh, we have LSU. They lost their precious star quarterback, Joe Burrow. Ohio State and Justin Fields, the arguably number 2 top candidate for the Heisman Trophy this year, he's not here anymore. We've got nothing to worry about, says Clemson, says Alabama, says Oklahoma and Lincoln Riley, and Georgia with Kirby Smart. And then the Big Ten decided to throw a massive curveball at the entirety of the NCAA football landscape and be like, 10 of the top 15 teams going into the year, they were essentially just wiped away, 10 of the top 15 teams. Spoiler alert for if you haven't seen Avengers Infinity War for some reason. They basically got Thanos snapped. The Big Ten and the Pac-12, they're just gone from the Power 5. Just gone from the entirety of the college football landscape. And then it's like, another spoiler alert, it's like the end of Endgame when they all just come back through the portals. Where just all of a sudden out of nowhere, everything just starts to return, and then there's just, it's like this giant reunion. Except instead of fighting with each other, like they did in the Avengers, they're fighting against each other for the top playoff spots. It's going to be very interesting to see how these teams pan out, especially considering how a lot of the top players, I believe, especially from Pac-12 and Big Ten colleges, I believe a lot of the star prospects have already started opting out for the draft, which, honestly, I can personally respect. There's sometimes you just got to go out, work your butt off to get to the next level, and it's what some might call grab the bag, get that dough, make your money. Because the NFL, they do not skimp out on those paychecks. But imagine being like one of the top prospects in a certain position and just having no film on you. That's going to make the draft process so much harder for some of these prospects. And for some of these teams, I don't know exactly who the prospects are. I know there's a bunch of them who opted out of the season to focus on getting prepared for the draft. I'll probably get that full list for the Wednesday show. But all I know is that this does not just change the landscape of the entirety of the NCAA, but the entirety of the relative programs. I know Justin Fields, the quarterback for Ohio State, has been desperately pushing for the start of football again by the Big Ten, which is a lot of signatures, by the way. We're in an era where all these athletes have their voices, where they have power now. Where all of these guys, these 18 to 22-year-old guys, they can make some serious impacts. And Justin Fields was one of them. By creating that petition for the NCAA to bring back football. Or maybe even not the NCAA specifically, but at least the Big Ten. I know Trevor Lawrence did that with the hashtag We Want to Play movement on Twitter. But imagine if somebody as powerful and as strong and as good as Justin Fields, a number 2 candidate right now for the Heisman behind Trevor Lawrence, imagine if he opts out of the year and does not play. It changes everything for Ohio State, I can say that much. And imagine some of these top other prospects in major positions like linebacker or offensive line or running backs, wide receivers, etc. Yes, it is a next man up sport. That's exactly what football is. It's a next man up sport. But imagine you have one of your captains, one of your leaders, one of your strongest people on the team, one of your foundation pieces just says, no, thank you. I'm going to the draft instead. I'm sure guys like Ryan Day and guys like Jim Harbaugh would be super mad about that. If I were in their shoes, I'd be pissed. But at the same time, I'd also support the decision. Be like, you're ready for the next level. You're good enough. Train for it. Get ready before you get there. That's a double-edged sword, especially when it comes to all these conferences coming back. Because could some of these players actually opt back in? Who knows, honestly. It'd be super cool if some of these players who opted out actually opt back in. If the NCAA gives them the chance, if these programs give them the chance. A lot of these prospects and players who opted out, they could absolutely ball out the second they say, you know what, maybe we'll play after all because you guys are playing and I don't want to be excluded from that. Some of that Jones effect, wanting to be included in that larger group. In this case, the football team. It's going to be so fun to see how this shakes up. It looks like right now, all of these respective conferences, both the Big Ten, the Pac-12, the Mountain West, and the MAC, it seems like they're all shooting for that benchmark, which is just the conference championship. Let's win the Big Ten championship. Let's win the Pac-12 championship, Mountain West, MAC, etc. Let's just win our conference. And let's see where it goes from there. It's kind of that simple. Imagine some of these other conferences, like you're in Oklahoma in the Big 12, or you're Clemson in the ACC, or you're Bama in Florida over in the PAC, over in the SEC. Imagine having to play your full slate of games, and then all of a sudden you get these new guys coming in, the Pac-12, the Big 12, etc. Pretty much just coming in and being like, hey, this is our territory now. You better look out for us. And yet they're playing less games than the guys who have already been there. Like, I'm looking at Oklahoma's schedule right now in the Big 12, and they're playing 10 games right now. Compared to the Big 12's 8, compared to the Pac-12's 7. Can you imagine being like a MAC team being filtered into all this? Like, it just does not make sense to me. I cannot wait to hear what the NCAA has to say about all this, at least in terms of trying to get some of these conferences who opted out and trying to find ways for them to sneak away into the college playoffs. Whether if it is Ohio State or whether Oregon jumps up into the top 4 or whether Wisconsin or Penn State makes a surprise run. I can't wait to see how that goes because it's got to be super, super cool to do. But the one thing I will stand by, and I was not far off when I called it back when the entirety of this college football landscape came back to normal. But at least for right now, I called it then, and I'm going to call it again now. If the NCAA does not let these teams into the college playoffs, so let's say no Big 12, no Pac-12, no Big 10, you're not allowed into the top 4 college playoff because, you know why? You have not played enough games because that's not fair to the teams who play all 10 games on their schedule. You've only played 8, you've only played 7, you've only played 8, play 10. Then do you know what they can do? Maybe Ohio State or Penn State or Oregon or whomever else in the Pac-12 and the Big 10, they're going to be out of it for the college football playoffs, but they can put all their eggs in the Rose Bowl basket. Because guess who plays each other in the Rose Bowl? The Pac-12 and the Big 10. In my personal favorite bowl game every single year, that's not the Final Four or the National Championship, that's my favorite bowl game out of all of them. I love the Big 10 and I love the Pac-12 individually. Put them against each other, it makes for classics. Like having USC and Sam Darnold lead a last-minute drive against Saquon Barkley and the Penn State Nittany Lions in the Rose Bowl, I want to say 3 years ago. Oh my God, that was an amazing Rose Bowl. One of my personal favorites. Literally because of reasons like that, the Rose Bowl is my favorite bowl game, aside from assuming the NCAA does not let the Big 10, the Pac-12 into the equation just because the games aren't the same. We have to see what the official update is because these updates literally happened. Like the Pac-12 literally announced their desire to come back 2 days ago. And, the NCAA has some shuffling to do. They got some work to do. But assuming there's a couple updates in the next several days, I will keep that you updated so feel free to catch us every Wednesday and every Saturday. But before we go any further, I just wanted to, and that's how these conferences are going to shake up the college football landscape. And this is how the brand new opt-ins for the college conferences, including the Big Ten, the Pac-12, the Mountain West, and the MAC, the MAC, is going to be changing up the game in the NCAA landscape and how they're going to work things out. But before we get into that, we are talking about sports gambling, and we're going to be talking about some of the best and the worst bets that you should take for this week if you want to take your money and put it where your mouth is for this coming Saturday slate of games. That's going to be coming up right after this.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Once again here on the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcasting Network. Once again, my name is Ryan Lee, and we just talked about how the NCAA football landscape has changed ever since the coronavirus pandemic has started. And the last segment I just had talked about how the introduction of the Big Ten, the Pac-12, the Mountain West, and the MAC all changes up the NCAA football landscape. And does it change the landscape? Well, I did answer that, and I think it does, actually. So even though it's all conference games, it really does. But 95% of that depends on how the NCAA responds to that. But nothing more about that. Because I want to transition into something a little more fun, you know? A little segment I like to call Put Your Money Where Your Mouth Is. So the thing is that I have some of the biggest and most impactful games throughout the entire landscape of this coming week. Specifically on Saturday, because, you know, all the big games throughout the week are coming on Saturday. And I'm going to be going through which one of the games has the best chance of going over, going under, which bet should you take, and why you should take them based on the things that I have gathered both from the eye test and the statistical advantage point. Okay, so this is one of my personal, one of the games I want to really go over because I think it's a bet that is actually going to be a really interesting one. Currently, Auburn, according to Caesars Palace and ESPN, are currently listed as a 7.5 point favorite. You might see a number a lot. You might see minus 7.5 if you look into Auburn versus Kentucky. And for all my new bettors, you might be wondering, what does that number mean? Well, it simply means this. If you choose to take a bet, especially when it comes to sports, they will give you what is called the spread, which is essentially the number of points a certain team is favored by. So the minus, if there's a minus in front, that means that team is the favorite. That means that Vegas, you know, the odds makers, I typically just refer them as Vegas, they believe that a certain team is going to win by that number of points. Now, you might be wondering, you can't win by 7.5 in a football game. That's very true. But the reason why they do that is to avoid any sort of push, any sort of tie. So that way is the definitive winner and definitive loser, because sometimes they have it on a flat number. Let's say for Auburn, Kentucky, that flat number was 7.0. If it was 7.0 and let's say the deficit is 7 on the nose, that just means anybody who took the over or the under, no one wins. That's really lame. It's not fun for anyone because it's just a tie, essentially. You just push Vegas, and that's no fun. So why they make it 7.5 is to make it, essentially makes the number 8. So basically, do you think that Auburn is going to win by the 7.5 that they're set at? Or do you think they're going to either lose flat out? So the plus 7.5 for Kentucky side, simply point is, if you pick that plus 7.5, that means you're picking Kentucky to either win flat out or to keep the game under a 7.5 point deficit. In this case, it is 7. So let's say hypothetically the game between Auburn and Kentucky goes 21-28. If you bet Kentucky, you will win because the point differential is under 7.5. But let's say the point differential was something like 10. Let's say it's 20-30. Well, that means if you picked Auburn and you took their side of the spread, you would win then because you said that Auburn is going to win by 7.5 points or more. That's how this works. I just wanted to give a quick explanation just to avoid any sort of confusion. And just to avoid any confusion, and for any new bettors out there, or even just anybody listening to this show, you can say you learned something new today. You learn something new every day. Well, there it is. You learned betting terminology. So I think some of the big matchups when it comes to this Kentucky versus Auburn game is the fact that these two teams are built in a very similar fashion, actually. Kentucky is a very run-heavy offense, when putting up in relationship to at least their total offense. And the overall offense for Auburn is relatively split down the middle. Out of their 406 yards last year, Auburn was 207 in the air versus 199 in the ground. So Auburn's a very even offense. However, Kentucky, they were very good on the run, 280 yards on the ground versus 113 in the air, which is what they averaged last year. And I think this is going to be a very cool matchup to see because at least in terms of the points, because at least in terms of the way that the two offenses are structured, they're very different. Auburn, they like to split things up a little bit. Hit you with a run here, hit you with a pass there. Run here, pass there, so on and so forth. Because they're, at least in terms of the yards, they're very similar. However, in terms of the attempts, you would say that Auburn's more of a rushing team because it's 42 attempts on the ground versus 30 in the air, which is what Auburn averaged last year. And you can definitely say that same thing about Kentucky, 44 attempts on the ground on average versus 19 attempts in the air for Kentucky, 20 if you round up. The thing about Kentucky is they do not have a great passing game. I will flat out admit that about Kentucky. They're not a good passing team. If Kentucky has any chance of winning this ball game or any chance of keeping it close to Auburn, they have to keep it on the ground. Except there's a huge issue with that, which is that Auburn has a really good rushing defense, which is sitting at 123 yards allowed, which is actually insane considering the fact that Kentucky's rushing attack had close to 300 yards, 280 to be exact. I expect this to be a ground and pound type of game from Kentucky, and from Auburn, I expect them to just absolutely exploit. For Auburn to deeply exploit Kentucky through the air, when you consider the fact that Auburn actually didn't have that bad of a passing attack. 57.8% completion in the air is not great for Bo Nix, but when you're comparing versus Kentucky, who allows essentially the same rate to opposing quarterbacks, it's more or less of a push. However, when you consider the big differences, at least in the run games, this is going to be a ground and pound, nose to the turf type of game. And this is going to be one where I could definitely see both teams just trying to bury their nose into the ground, just push the pile as much as possible. But the thing that's concerning me the most is the points per game on offense. Because Kentucky, yes, they were averaging a grand total of 27 points on offense. Auburn was averaging 32 points on offense, which is a lot, especially in an NCAA game. And the thing is, if you take their defenses into the equation, they are essentially a wash. 19.3 points against for Kentucky versus 19.5 against for Auburn. They are an absolute wash. So this is going to be a game where the offense is going to rule all. These teams have not played since 2015. But the thing is that Auburn, Auburn has won the last two matches against Kentucky. That's dating back to 2010. In their entire history, Auburn leads 26-6-1. But the big hiccup is the two times that Auburn has won, Kentucky's kept it close. They've kept it to 3 points in both the last two games, and those are both in Auburn, just like this game is. And I expect a pattern to come about. I do expect Auburn to come out on top, but is 7.5 a bit too much? I think just a tiny bit. I think Auburn's going to win the game. I'm not doubting myself on that. But the thing is that 7.5 is a bit much. I can see 7 on the nose, but I cannot see 8+. So I would say if you want to bet on Kentucky versus Auburn, you should go plus 7.5 on Kentucky. The next game I'm going to be talking about is going to be another battle between top 25 teams, which is going to be number 21 Pitt versus number 24 Louisville. And currently Pitt is on a 2-0 streak right now, while Louisville is currently sitting at 1-1. Now, right now Pitt is favored by 3 even, and there's no halves, which I kind of wish there was, but there's not. The thing about Pitt is that they have not faced high quality opponents. They played one decent quality opponent, but not a high quality opponent in Austin Peay, winning 55-0, and then to Syracuse 21-10. I don't care about the Austin Peay game. That's a throwaway. I care about the Syracuse game though, because Syracuse is formidable, and they won 21-10 to Syracuse, and Syracuse is a good program. And of course, I can say the exact same thing about Louisville. Western Kentucky 35-21. That doesn't mean squat to me. However, losing to a tough Miami team 47-34, that is going to be a killer for Louisville. But the thing is that these two teams are destined. I mean destined for an absolute shootout, because currently both teams, they are averaging 34.5 points for Louisville, 38 points for Pitt. However, if there's anything that these two teams can walk away from, it's the fact that defense is most likely not going to win the championship, but it's going to win this game. But at the same time, the quality of opponents matters. The fact that Louisville gave up 21 points to a team like Western Kentucky is something that can be argued as a little bit worrisome, because Western Kentucky is not by any means any sort of powerful school, but the 47 to Miami was absolutely killer, because the thing about teams like Louisville, who put tough games on the schedule first, they're battle tested. They know how to handle the pressure. They understand what it's like to have this nationally televised game where it actually matters. I mean, 47-34, that is a shootout. And if there's anything that I can get out of the Miami-Louisville game, at least that I was able to see, it's the fact that Malik Cunningham, he is ready for a shootout. Because in 2 games so far, he has been absolutely outstanding so far. 45 for 70, which equates to 64%, 64.3 to be exact. He has 650 yards so far to 2 games, which is an average of 325. And he is currently sitting at 6 touchdowns and 2 picks, which is average ratio of 3-1, which is really good for a quarterback at any level to throw for 300 or more yards in only 2 starts on the year so far, because that's something that is kind of considered a benchmark in today's football landscape. And another thing is that Louisville, they have a good rushing attack too with Javion Hawkins, who's currently sitting at 235 yards and 2 touchdowns, which is really good for a running back, especially, going in for only 2 years, a sophomore product. It's actually something that you really like to see, because Louisville and Pitt have a very similar strength, which is running the ball. 176.5 yards for Louisville versus 137 for Pitt. However, the big discrepancy here is in the passing game. As I said earlier, Malik Cunningham for Louisville is averaging 325 a game. I can't say the same thing about the Pitt Panthers, because right now, Kenny Pickett, he is having an all-right season so far. 39 for 56, which is 69%, which is pretty good. But the thing is, he's been relatively conservative with the ball, because he's only had shy of 500 yards a game, which is only at 262 yards a game. That's relatively conservative for, a quarterback with that type of system. But the thing is that they have done a relatively good time running the ball. But the thing that really scares me the most, if you are Louisville coming into Pitt, is that it's going to be a battle of strengths. Because it is not just necessarily going to be a shootout, but what it is going to be is that it's going to be a strength of offense versus defense. The Louisville offense versus the Pitt defense. And I can argue that Pitt has not really faced many quality opponents, as I said, Austin Peay and Syracuse, because they've held their opponents so far to 5 points a game, which is great if you look at the number standpoint. But add the context to it. You had a much lower level school. You also beat Syracuse, who is been towards the bottom of the ACC, towards the middle of the ACC over the past several years. Nothing crazy. Yes, 154 yards allowed seems amazing. Yes, 26 rush yards allowed seems amazing. Along with 120 pass yards allowed, it seems amazing. It seems like they've got everything that they need in order to stop Malik Cunningham and the Cardinals. However, context matters in this situation, as well as every situation ever. Pitt has not faced a quality opponent until now. Louisville is at least battle-tested. They fought in the trenches against Miami. They know what it's like to fight against a hard opponent. It was 17 versus 18 in terms of the opening rankings. Malik Cunningham had a great day versus Miami. 307 yards, 3 touchdowns, and a pick. And also, Javion Hawkins had 164 of his yards against Miami alone. This Louisville team can hang with some big boys. And the thing is that Louisville has a crazy schedule coming up. I don't know who's the one who created Louisville's schedule, but they put themselves through a gauntlet. After Pitt, they've got Georgia Tech, number 7 Notre Dame, Florida State, Virginia Tech, Virginia, Syracuse, Boston College, and Wake Forest. I mean, Louisville put themselves to an absolute gauntlet. And I can't say really the same about Pittsburgh, at least for the next couple of weeks, because they got NC State and Boston College, who aren't crazy, but they played 2 good opponents right after that in Miami and Notre Dame, as well as Florida State. And then they end the year with Virginia Tech and Clemson. Pitt, you are bold for the end of the year. Not so bold in the beginning. I want to say that the numbers in front of me are what's going to come to fruition, but it's not. 3 seems about right. At least in my point of view. 3 seems right. These 2 teams are very even in terms of the win-loss column with each other. The overall record is that Pitt has the advantage on Louisville, 9-8. So literally, Louisville could tie the series between these 2 teams this Saturday if they want to. Pitt won the last one in Pitt, but that was back in 2015. Louisville won 2012. Pitt won the 4 before that. Louisville won the 7 before that. So we'll just have to wait and see, because when you have 2 teams as tight as this, it really can go either way. the last game that I want to focus on that I think is going to at least, spark some sort of conversation is going to be Cincinnati and Army. Because I've had a chance to at least see Army work so far. Currently sitting at number 22 in the rankings right now. But the thing about Cincinnati is that Cincinnati played Austin Peay 55-20, and Army defeated Middle Tennessee 42-0, and they beat UL Monroe 37-7, which is not much better. And the thing is that they're both very similar schematically. They like to play defense that's very rigid and hard-nosed, and they both like to have a high-flying offense, as exemplified by their total yards so far. 525 in the one game versus Austin Peay for Cincinnati, and in the 2 games played so far by Army, they have a grand total of 418 yards per game on average. 39.5 points by Army. 55 scored in the one game by Cincinnati. It's like they're asking for this game to be a shootout, but of course they don't know that it's going to be. And the crazy thing about it is that we can't go off of any recent trends, because the last time these two teams played, 2004, where a lot of these players were probably 1 year old or 2 years old by now. And some of the players going into the draft, the rookies, they were maybe somewhere in the ballpark of 6 years old, I want to say. That was the last time these two teams played each other. But my biggest issue is that I feel like I know what I'm getting out of Army. But it seems like Army doesn't exactly know what they want to do. Yes, they're a very big ground and pound team, and that's 100% exemplified by Christian Anderson and his statistical line, which is 31 carries, 149 yards, and 3 touchdowns through 2 games, averaging 70 yards, averaging 75 yards almost, touchdown and a half per game. They want to be a ground and pound team where they can kind of rely on the defense a little bit. But I'm not sure how well that's going to fly. And the fact that there's no clear advantage here, I'm going to go solely based on what I have seen so far. And Cincinnati just looks like the better team, just based on the eye test alone. They look like the better team schematically, at least in terms of game planning. Cincinnati looks like the better team. Army is a very physical team, though, and they love to just completely pound your team whenever they get the chance, because they're the Army after all. They just love to really stick it to some guys, really compete hard, get that dirt, get their nose in the dirt. I took some time to think about it. I think 13 is reasonable. I could definitely see this game being closer to 2 scores, but is 13 too much? That's the big question, because every time Cincinnati has won this series, at least thus far, it's been tight. 2003, 33-29. 2001, 24-21. 2000, 23-17. But when Army has won, dating all the way back to 1963, 22-0, 37-20, 48-29. The thing is that Cincinnati, every time they've beaten Army, they've kept it close. But the thing is that things have changed so much in the past 16 years. But if there's one thing that I like to see, it's that even when everything has changed, when the players have changed, when the coaches have changed, when the cultures have changed, generally speaking, programs don't change. School programs do not change. LSU has been LSU for the past several decades. Florida's been as good as Florida has been for the past several decades. Ohio State has been a powerhouse for decades. It's just the way that the ADs and the assistant ADs and the next AD in line or the next coaching staff, they tend to follow after the coach before them. And this circumstance is no different. I'm going to say Cincinnati wins, and I think they're going to, by the slimmest of margins, cover the spread. 14, 17 points is what I'm going to say in terms of Cincinnati versus Army. We got one last segment before we wrap up this very first episode of the GSMC College Football Podcast with, once again, your host, Ryan Lee. And that is just talking about the NCAA versus the NFL. Does the NCAA and how well you do in college matter at all when it comes to NFL success? We've seen some generational talent come from the NCAA level, make it to the pros. Some no-names succeeding very well in the pros. And there's also been a lot of busts. Does college performance matter? Let's take a look at this past year's draft class through 2 weeks of the NFL and see how it looks. That's all coming up right after this.
Are you looking for help for your fantasy football team? Check out the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. Get today's best advice on who to start, who to sit, even who you should draft. From sleeper picks to red-hot lineups, they got it all covered for you. That's gsmcpodcast.com/fantasy-football-podcast. We'll cover traditional leagues, dynasty, PPR, even IDP leagues. When you need fantasy help, there's just one show to hit up. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
And we're back here on the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcasting Network. Once again, Ryan Lee here. I just brought up the changes in the NCAA landscape due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the return of the Big Ten, the Pac-12, the Mountain West, and the MAC, and how that not only affects the college football landscape, but how it affects the conferences individually, as well as the players within each of those conferences. And I just went over the best and worst of the do's and don'ts of sports betting in the brand new segment, Put Your Money Where Your Mouth Is. I'm going to strive a little bit away from talking purely about the NCAA into talking about something that I personally have had a lot of experience with, which is the drafting process and turning these college prospects into potential NFL level talent. Now, you may or may not have seen the draft from all the way back in April. I most certainly did. Some of the top prospects across the board include, and I'm going to start first with the guys who haven't played yet, because the guys who haven't played yet are also in interesting situations that I would love to go into a little bit. Let's start with the number 5 overall draft pick, Tua Tagovailoa. He was the Alabama standout who broke his hip last year and is now a member of the Miami Dolphins, backing up the beard, Ryan Fitzpatrick. And honestly, this can really go one of two ways, because Tua is in a very interesting position. Either Tua can follow a very similar success path as Patrick Mahomes, which is he backed up an experienced veteran. He took the time to learn the playbook, to understand the system, to understand the culture, to understand everything there is to know about the organization inside and out. And literally the second Mahomes got his opportunity, which was when Alex Smith got traded from the Kansas City Chiefs to the Washington football team, Mahomes stepped in. He was able to stand big and tall and won MVP immediately the same year. And then won the Super Bowl MVP the next year. No big deal, Patrick Mahomes. And then he earns a $500 million contract. Nothing special, Oh, wait, except it is. But obviously we still have to see for Tua, because he is learning behind one of the most experienced and one of the longest tenured players in the National Football League right now in Ryan Fitzpatrick, the Harvard grad. And Tua is going to learn so much from Fitzpatrick, including the fact that not only is Fitzpatrick experienced, but he knows how to deal with multiple environments and multiple markets. He knows how to deal with getting signed. He knows how to deal with moving from location to location. Assuming, and this is purely assuming, that Chan Gailey sticks around after Fitzpatrick retires, Tua already knows the Chan Gailey system. He already knows the terminology involved. He knows all the schematics, everything like that. Tua's going to be in a great position when time to come. But do you know who else is going to be in an amazing position when the time comes? The Utah State standout, Jordan Love. Because he was the talk of the draft. They went for the future instead of for the now. The predecessor to Aaron Rodgers, and they're going to fall into very similar categories Tua and Jordan Love will, as will Jacob Eason, since he was drafted from Washington to the Indianapolis Colts, learning from another amazing, experienced quarterback in Phillip Rivers. However, Rivers and Eason are not necessarily the perfect match because Tua and Jordan Love at least fit the style of the respective quarterbacks a little bit. Being able to move, being a little more strong-armed or a little more pinpoint accurate, so on and so forth. That fits their game more or less. However, Jacob Eason's in a peculiar position because, yes, Jacob Eason's a good pocket passer, but he knows how to move a little bit, and Phillip Rivers cannot move to save his life. Jalen Hurts is in a very interesting position to me, because he can either start or he can stay the backup to Carson Wentz and the Philadelphia Eagles. Because with the way Wentz has been performing, Jalen Hurts can easily step in and take over the entire team, and then it's bye-bye Wentz. Have fun with that $33.5 million, assuming it continues to go poorly for Wentz and Jalen Hurts somehow just kills it right out of the gate, the second-round draft pick from Oklahoma to Philadelphia Eagles. And I'm going to skip around to the last quarterback who is a known backup, and because he was in a very peculiar position, especially the offseason, and that is Georgia's Jake Fromm, because of the racially insensitive text that leaked with Jake Fromm. But the thing is that Jake Fromm, the good thing about Buffalo is when they drafted him, he was simply put in the 5th round, too good to give up at that spot. They're hoping that when Josh Allen goes down for whatever reason, that Jake Fromm can be the guy who steps in, not Matt Barkley. Matt Barkley is not bad. But with what I've been hearing from Bills insiders and all that, Jake Fromm has great potential to be a top-level backup, which is really needed in the NFL. Now let's go to the guys who have played so far, at least in the quarterback market. There's only 2 of them so far. It's Joe Burrow and it's Justin Herbert. And Justin Herbert, I'm going to start with him first because it was a weird circumstance what happened in the NFL this past week. So the LA Chargers' starting quarterback, Tyrod Taylor, was supposed to start. And the team doctor was supposed to give Taylor an injection to reduce the pain in his cracked ribs. And they wound up puncturing a lung. I don't get how that's possible, but it happened. And Justin Herbert got thrust in there for week 2 versus the Kansas City Chiefs, and it looks like he's starting again this week as well. We'll have to get an update on Justin Herbert after next week, but so far he was great versus that Kansas City game because he just seemed to be absolutely lighting it up. Yes, they did not come away with a win because of Mahomes' magic, but 22 for 33 for 311 yards, 1 touchdown and a pick, as well as a rushing touchdown as well for Justin Herbert. Not a bad start. I'm not going to lie. That's not a bad start at all. Especially for a young rookie like Justin Herbert. 2 touchdowns in your debut, 300 yards. That's a good debut. I think Justin Herbert can definitely make something out of the NFL, assuming that he's not going to get usurped by somebody else who's just slightly ahead of him on the depth chart, primarily Tyrod Taylor in this case, because I think when the time comes, which is going to be soon, especially if Herbert is playing again, especially if not only if Herbert is playing again, but if Tyrod Taylor continues to be injured and Herbert continues to light it up the same way he did against Kansas City, literally running over a defensive tackle in the middle of a design run, Justin Herbert is going to be a weapon. Justin Herbert's going to take this LA Chargers team one day out of the brink of the mediocre bucket. The one year when the Chargers made the AFC Championship about a decade ago, I think that's about where the ceiling lies for Justin Herbert. Could I see Herbert making a Super Bowl? That's going to be tough to say because, yes, the Chargers have great weapons, but the thing is that Herbert's too experienced now, and he's not going to get that experience for another 3 years. By the time those 2 to 3 years pass, maybe 4 years plus, all the weapons he's got, Keenan Allen, Derwin James, Brian Bulaga, Austin Eckler, Chris Harris, Joey Bosa, Melvin Ingram, etc. Like, do you realize how hard it is to pay an all-pro safety? Do you realize how difficult it is to pay a pass rusher who can get easily 10 sacks in a year with zero problems at hand? Oh yeah, I do. He became the richest player in NFL history. You're welcome, Joey Bosa. So yeah, the Chargers, they're going to be good. But it's also tough because you got Kansas City in your division. And you got Mahomes on the other side of the ball when that happens. And Drew Lock has been pretty good for the Broncos so far. And Derek Carr has shown that him and Gruden can work together. Herbert's going to struggle, but he'll be fine. But a quarterback who I'm surprised has not really struggled as much as he should have is Joe Burrow, the Heisman winner from last year, because he's been outstanding through 2 games so far. Yes, the Bengals are currently 0-2, which stinks. But he's at a 61.9% completion percentage, 509 yards through 2 games, 3 touchdowns, 1 interception, and I believe he has 1 rushing touchdown as well in the mix. Yes, he does. Only 15 yards, but still another touchdown. That's 4 touchdowns in 2 games. Joe Burrow has been very good so far, and he's been in dogfights thus far against the Chargers and against the Cleveland Browns. But the biggest thing with Burrow is my current thing about Sam Darnold, which is that they're very talented. Like, I personally think Darnold is super talented. I think Joe Burrow is super talented. I think they can both be exactly what the quintessential quarterback is in the NFL. However, the biggest issue is that they've got nothing around them. And yet, think about what Joe Burrow had last year. He had Thad Moss. He had Justin Jefferson. He had Clyde Edwards-Helaire right behind him. He had everything at his disposal last year at LSU. And that's a large chunk of the reason why Joe Burrow had the greatest season in college football history last year. He's not going to break any records this year, Joe Burrow. He might break one. He might have a chance at Baker Mayfield's rookie touchdown record. He might have a chance, which is currently sitting at 27, I believe. But aside from that, Joe Burrow is going to struggle for a long time unless he gets the pieces together. It sucks to see that from the Heisman quarterback. But at the same time, Burrow has been great so far. For the most part, none of that matters. But to some people, it does. However you guys rank these young gentlemen, these young 21, 22-year-olds, they're going to have success at the NFL level as long as they give themselves success at the NFL level, as long as they work for it. As long as they work for it, as long as they put themselves in that position, these young, strong athletes, they're going to be in good shape. Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for today. Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show and rate us 5 stars down below. It would really help us out, and please follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Don't forget, we do not only air on Saturdays, but we air on both Saturdays and on Wednesdays. So check back here on Wednesday for another installment of the GSMC College Football Podcast. With the GSMC College Football Podcast and the GSMC Podcast Network, I am Ryan Lee. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows from the GSMC Podcast Network, from football to basketball, baseball to MMA, and even soccer. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast.